Experimental cinema, experimental filmmaking, moments of perception. That's what we're going to talk about today with four experts, four authors of a book that's called Moments of Perception, Experimental Film in Canada. From left to right, at least in my screen, we have Barbara Sternberg. Barbara, welcome. How are you doing?
Good.
Thank you for being with us. We have also Michael Sweet. Michael, how are you? Okay, Michael, you're muted, but that's okay. In experimental film, everything goes. Hi, how are you? Jim Shedden. Hi, Jim.
Hello.
And Stephen Rumer. Stephen, how are you doing? Well, first of all, I wanted to know because it's not usual doing a book about experimental film. I don't know if in Canada every week you have a book about experimental cinema. You will tell me. But how did you decide to do this book? Why? Why did you decide it? And how did you get in touch with each other and said, well, we're going to do, with the four of us, a book called Moments of Perception. Who's going to tell it? Barbara.
Okay.
Yeah.
Jim and I got together a number of years ago and talked about, first of all, the need for a book like this. There are a lot of small individual books on a particular filmmaker.
Yeah.
But nothing comprehensive, nothing that covers the field and gives the history of it and the strength and the depth of the area in Canada.
Mm-hmm.
So we got together, we talked for quite a while about what the book might contain, what the structure of it would be, how we would organize the material.
Mm-hmm.
And then Jim and I approached Mike to we decided on a structure that would be two parts. One would focus on the history in Canada of experimental film, and the other would be to focus on a critical analysis of films and filmmakers' bodies of work. And for that, we approached Stephen Brumer to carry that out. We had thought at one point of making it an anthology, but we decided that didn't give a unified, a cohesive enough picture for people to get involved, the reader to get involved with. So we decided on that two-part structure, a history section and a filmmaker film section.
Mm-hmm. Michael, and you have started your part in 2011, isn't it?
It certainly feels like it started in 2011 and probably before. So the gestation of the book, it was really Barbara and Jim's brilliant idea to put this together.
Mm-hmm.
And as Barbara says, the idea, because there's no book like this that provides an overview of what's been an incredibly vibrant and important field of Canadian arts, it was important to try and create a kind of unified and cohesive sense of it, as Barbara says. At the same time, one of the things that I think all of us wanted to do was acknowledge just how multiplicitous and varied and complex this field of discourse is. So in all of our writings, I think we're trying to provide a snapshot, but we're acknowledging that the snapshot, like all snapshots, is partial. The book was conceived, and then research and writing. In some ways, most of my writing happened over COVID times, and so the lockdown served scholarship well, as it does sometimes. And what I've tried to do in my section is, because I knew that Stephen, who's an excellent and amazing critic of films, was going to be covering attention to artists, I wanted to provide an overview of the people behind the scenes. And so I focused on institutions that help make these films, fund them, exhibit them, to give a sense of what I call an ecosystem within Canada. And so I didn't focus on the films themselves, but looked at the ways in which the things that enabled them to be made, the ways in which they were distributed, the way they were talked about. And I did that in three parts. Very quickly, a kind of definition of terms. Second of all, a kind of mini history from about 1934 into the present. And then what I call coast to coast to coast, just looking at different scenes across the country to give a sense of points of activity within that. So that was my contribution to the book. But the idea of focusing on institutions in some ways is a bit odd, but I think given how complex Canadian experimental film is, it makes sense for this book, given the strength of Stephen's contributions and also the capsule reviews by Barbara and Jim.
Yeah, great. Jim, how did you manage to fit it all in 352 pages, as I get? Because there are more filmmakers and there are more stories than fit in this number of pages, isn't it?
Right. Well, I mean, we didn't start out with the idea of it being quite as comprehensive as it became. But then once you go down that road, then it's clear that you're going to publish something that excludes a lot of filmmakers. And that's okay. That's every book on every artistic subject excludes people, right?
Yeah.
So there's room for another project by someone else, another book or a website or whatever that might tackle, might look at, the other 100 or 200 or many hundreds of filmmakers that are not here. But it did become, it just, at a certain point, there's a continuum, right? So there's, books that deal with a couple of filmmakers and books that, deal with 5 or 6 filmmakers. And this wasn't, we didn't quite know exactly the shape here, but we knew that it needed to be something that could easily serve as a textbook by someone who may be fairly new to the subject themselves, So we had this mythical idea of someone, a film professor in like Kamloops or Brandon, Manitoba or something, and they were suddenly told they had to teach Canadian experimental film. So here's where you could start, and the history is there, and it is a kind of interesting history in that an institutional history is a very Canadian history, and it's actually true, I think, to the history, to the subject. And then you would have critical essays on the filmmakers that you knew you were going to be teaching, right? So Michael Snow and Jack Chambers and Joyce Wheeland and David Rimmer, and then that started to get more elastic. So Stephen wrote on Guérané Torossian and Kelly Egan, and the kind of the whole that field of who's if it's not a canon, but who can you talk about at that kind of level? Who has, and then it was really clear to us that we just wanted to have some information on, this vast array of filmmakers that make up this, like when you look back historically, things always get kind of reduced to, because they have to, I suppose, there's only so many words, to Michael Snow, Joyce Wheeland, Jack Chambers, David Rimmer, maybe Al Razutis. These filmmakers like Andrew Lugg and Blaine Allen and so on get left out of the history for all intents and purposes. We wanted to acknowledge that. And just, where things are going, things are more and more heterogeneous, and there are more and more people making non-narrative, non-documentary, not commercial animation, this kind of, personal, visual films driven by a personal vision. So we see that there's people doing that. Anyway, I'm sort of rambling on here, but that's the. It did definitely evolve organically as we did the work. I have to say one other thing too, that we talk about that a lot, but so much of the work for the editors, for Barbara and I, was just about persistence, right? It was just about okay, we didn't get that grant. Okay, we're late. Okay, don't we don't have a deal with the publisher yet. We don't. It was just kind of like believing that it would somehow come together despite obstacles along the way. I mean, if someone told us at the beginning, this will take you 5.5 years, that would have sounded crazy. We might not have done it. It took 5.5 years.
Can I just?
Sure.
Is it okay if I add something, Jim? Are you?
Yeah, I'm done.
Okay. No, I just wanted to add something. When I had said the structure was 2-part, Mike's historical and Stephen, whom we'll come to with the critical essays on certain filmmakers, Jim and I, it ended up being a 3-part structure. Yeah. Which that's it. The third part has a lot of entries on individual filmmakers. Jim and I enter shorter ones because of the number of filmmakers, good filmmakers with bodies of work that we wanted to include, but couldn't in Stephen's section. So, and the choice in Stephen's section was to not duplicate a canon of, there are so many people, great filmmakers in Canada have long bodies of work, have been working for years and are continuing to work, like Michael Snow.
For sure.
But we didn't want the section that Stephen was writing to only feature those filmmakers, although they deserve it. We wanted to indicate in Stephen's section that this was an ongoing genre, that there were new filmmakers with different perspectives and different life stories and who were at a different point in their careers, but they should still get the attention that Stephen's individual essays were going to give them. And by not having only the older filmmakers with huge bodies of work in that section, we were signaling an opening of the canon, which Mike's section also was grappling with. How do you write about something and not get stuck in, sort of a model that no longer is appropriate. So the third section then that Jim and I wrote came about because there were so many wonderful filmmakers that we couldn't fit into Stephen's section that we said, okay, fine, we're going to include them, but, we'll make a third section. And I think the fact that there's over 100 filmmakers speaks to the strength of experimental film in Canada. I did want to say one other thing about the purpose of the book, which Jim was saying,
Sure.
We were thinking that perhaps it could be used as a textbook in film studies courses. But also, I particularly cared to let the genre of experimental film be known more widely. Because as I said at the very beginning of the introduction, whenever I say to people, because I am a filmmaker, whenever I say what I do, I make experimental films, every single time, without exception, the response to my saying that is, what's that? So I think the book is also aimed at a more general public, the art world, and the general public, to let them know, A, what experimental film is, that it exists, that it's existed as long as there's been film, and that it's wonderful, and Canadian experimental film, obviously. The Canadians, unfortunately, across all the art, don't know our own artists. So the book, we hope, fulfills a lot of functions, or possibly fulfills a lot of functions.
Completely. Completely. I must say the first one I knew was Stephen because I think it was accredited in maybe ITFA Film Festival, Stephen, that you presented a film. And I said, well, this experimental Canadian filmmaker is very interesting. This is amazing. And well, then I knew.
Shucks, thank you.
Then I knew that you had done over 30, over 40 films, and I say, well, this is more time than I have to watch, so I have to interview him. And then I knew
it's the common curse that I face. I make too much work, people can't watch it.
Yeah. We have to watch it with one eye and with another eye, two at a time, or I don't know, experimental viewing. And then, well, there was the news that you had the book, and well, we can all together talk about experimental film. And there's been a lot of talk about your section, but how did you choose the filmmakers that appear there?
Well, I should just clarify that really the filmmaker list was forged in conversation, but largely by Barbara and Jim. So I can't take credit for the wonderful inclusions that have been made that might otherwise not have been made. Filmmakers of an emerging generation, I would say, still, though many of us are middle-aged, who have generally been not exactly excluded from histories, but the histories that have been written have often been written before our time. There are a lot of filmmakers represented in this section who are the inheritors of a lot of that institutional history that Mike has written about. But we haven't necessarily had all that many opportunities to forge ahead and build our own institutions, as it were, or to have our own histories told. So in that sense, the section that I dealt with has a good showing, I think, of fairly contemporary filmmakers, though there are many more in Barbara and Jim's section, and the filmmakers who have traditionally defined Canadian cinema, or by whose work Canadian cinema has traditionally been defined. Filmmakers like, we've mentioned Snow many times, but Arthur Lipset, Joyce Wieland, Jack Chambers. And I came to this project having already done a kind of, I like to think of it as an omnibus book of 3 little books about Mike Snow, Jack Chambers, and Joyce Wieland. This book called Codes for North that came out about 3-4 years ago. So I had this background with that side of things, and then I'd also been writing pieces about contemporary filmmakers, some of whom are in Jim and Barbara's section, Kyle Whitehead, for instance, and some of the filmmakers who I've covered here, like Alexandre LaRose. I came on board the project after it had been underway for a while, but I had been aware of it, and I'd been talking to both Jim and Barbara about it at different times, and to Mike about it. I tend to see my section as a complementary section to Mike's, because I don't really think that institutional histories and aesthetic histories can be separated. We've done an able job of it, but I think that they're always co-implicated. And many of the aesthetics that I've dealt with in my section that kind of tie together bodies of work, aesthetic modes, subgenres, if you will, like diaristic filmmaking and so on, those themes are at the core of any kind of institutional self-definition of what Canadian cinema has been. So in many ways, I see my work as being support works for Mike's section, because as someone who's also written institutional histories of Canadian cinema, it's enough of a mouthful to get out just exactly what happened to set wheels in motion without dealing with the kind of work that's traditionally a critic's task of what are these themes, what are these forms, what can they mean, how are they shaped over the course of a body of work. One thing I would say about the filmmakers that we chose for my section is that this isn't something that's only true of them. It's also true of many of the filmmakers in Jim and Barbara's section, but consistently the filmmakers that I wrote about are ones for whom themes have emerged and developed consistently over time. Some of them have had little, modest bodies of work, in some cases ended tragically, like Arthur Lipset. And others
and by choice, like Eliette, who made 4 wonderful, wonderful films and then went silent for a very long time, has recently come back with some incredible video art. But for the most part, they're filmmakers who have a coherent body of work. We can say their work is about these themes. It travels from point A to point B. It develops over time. So to answer your question, I think that's something that strongly influenced our opinion of what would go into that middle section. It's why you have filmmakers in there like Barbara. Barbara is one of Canada's most prolific experimental filmmakers, and she's made incredible work that always changes. And I'd say that with each film, she's modulating base themes that she established early on and bringing new material in and drawing ideas into new forms. I mean, if you see the exchange between Barbara's work in film and the work that she's done in video, you can see this very clearly. So that's just one example. I write in the pieces about filmmakers like Christina Battle. Christina Battle, who started out in a kind of alchemical material formalist mode and has moved more and more into gallery video installation work that is often of I would say a distinctly rebellious spirit that was always at the heart of her work, but that's become foregrounded in a way. So there's a lot of work, it's a huge body of work. There's a lot more filmmakers that I wish I could have written about. But to go back to the core mission of this book, our hope is that these are filmmakers who will get taught, will get integrated into curriculums, will get known by their fellow Canadians and maybe a little bit by audiences internationally. I don't know if anyone has anything they want to add.
Completely.
I do. That was wonderful, Stephen. And I just want to add that Jim and I were quite aware of the hugeness, I don't know, is that a word? The hugeness of the task we were giving Stephen. To ask Stephen to write out 25 filmmakers with bodies of work that he had to, anyway, come up as he has explained that he was able to do anyway, it was a huge task, and we knew that when we were asking him to do it.
Completely. I get it. Christina Battle. I don't know why the book, I had it in alphabetical order, and I was in the set when you said Christina Battle, but now viewers can see a piece of the work because it's amazing. In your book, we can stop the film like frame by frame because a lot of experimental films are beautiful frame by frame. That's amazing. Or even some painted experimental films are even seen in the celluloid itself. And that's the magic of experimental cinema, that different ways of approaching the audiovisual language, but also Barbara. And as Stephen mentioned you as a filmmaker, I wanted you to introduce one of the things that you all acknowledge through the book. That's the, for instance, approach to minorities or underrepresented collectives like maybe indigenous, maybe women, maybe LG. I always get lost in the letters, but all the different visions of sexuality. These are things that have been pioneered, or at least have come easier into experimental film than in other films. How you see it? Or you or Jim? Jim was saying yes. So yeah.
I mean, I actually really think Mike has looked at this issue the most. This was like present in our minds making the book, but there's no for whatever reason, partly to do with actual population of Canada, but also just kind of cultural demographics. This has been by and large a white person's game. Yeah, not just in Canada, but that's also true in other countries. And we're looking for the cracks. Where is that no longer true, or where was that not true historically? And I think Mike did a very kind of thorough research in that area, but I'm going to pass it over to him because he's got more authority here. I think.
Yeah. I think it's a really interesting question. As Jim says, if you look at the history of experimental film, like almost every single other fine art form in Canada, it was dominated by the culturally dominant people, and often that was white folks, and often it was men. And at different periods within the experimental film, like any other medium, you did have that period of dominance. You kind of had a boys' club mentality in the 1960s at different places. But the thing that I think is different about experimental film, if you contrast it with, say, industrial commercial film, or even the world of documentary, which have greater funding from the central government, it's an experimental film that you get people who are outside of the mainstream finding ways to make films, partly because of the low budgets, partly because sometimes there are cultural initiatives from the arts councils, sometimes because students are coming up, a new generation of students were coming up, and experimental film is kind of like almost like a default genre. You get to play in school and work on films. So interestingly, you have the women start to be able to make experimental films way earlier than they could in the feature film or documentary film worlds, LGBTQ peoples as well. And then as you had the waves of immigration in Canada from the 1980s onward, more and more people from different communities were making work. So I'll just give as a story. The Images Film Festival, it started in 1988, 1989, as an experimental film festival that included film and video. And if you look at the history of that festival, as through the programming, people started to realize, there's certain films that are being clustered here, or certain films that are being excluded, and I want to show them. So you had these kind of offshoots from that festival. Real Asian began as a way to foreground Asian Canadian filmmakers. Often these offshoot festivals included narrative, documentary, and experimental work, but sometimes it was the experimentalists who were leading the way. There's the Alucine Festival, which is a really important Latin American festival that began in 1995. Partly as a reaction against the way in which they didn't see enough Latin American or Spanish-speaking artists being represented there, but also sometimes coming through, sometimes they were represented in the festival. So you have artists like Francesca Duran, Jorge Lozano, who were involved in the festival and had their film screened. So you kind of have these offshoots and the beginnings of a more, what is a truer picture of the multiculturalism of Canada, often emerge through the ways in which these festivals and other institutions came through the experimental film world. But I'd say it's from the 1990s and into today, when we have an incredibly diverse landscape of experimental film production, distribution, exhibition, and discourse.
Okay, we've been talking now for half an hour, and we haven't talked about what is experimental film. But if somebody wants to know about it, read the book, because I think it's almost like half of the book. Michael tries to define what is experimental film, Canadian, and that takes a lot of time, isn't it? But anyway, I wanted to ask you, yes, Jim.
Just as much as we want people to read the book, they should also watch some films.
Yeah.
So if you watch a handful of experimental films, you'll start to know what they are.
Right.
That's it. That's it completely.
And then it's helpful to read about it, but not everyone wants to read about it, and it's that can be a pointless exercise if you haven't actually seen films.
So
I think
the chicken and the egg. But I do want to mention about the book one thing that Jim especially was very concerned with, and I think made sure that it worked out well, and that's the quality of the images. Because one doesn't have to read the book. One can flip through and see so much, interesting treatment of images. It gives an idea of different themes, but also of the possibilities of the film medium itself, the emulsion, what one can do with it. And for that reason, because it was so crucial to the idea of experimental film was the image. And Jim was found a printer who was, I think, fabulous. I think the images in the book are just gorgeous and really give one flipping through it a good idea of the variety of experimental film and the beautiful possibilities of film as a medium.
Completely.
So without even going into it too much, just randomly I came upon this Louise Bourque image, right?
I just put that image. Yes. That's amazing.
So you know right
fantastic.
Away. Yeah. Titanic or something. You know you're in a different realm here.
Yeah.
And that's what and that's kind of amazing because that's not much. You're not really experiencing the film, but you can get that little glimpse, and on it goes. Or that something like this Michael Snow film.
Oh,
that it's weird.
Yes. Yeah.
Right? So that's good. So experimental films are weird. They're not for everybody.
Yeah.
But that's also true of poetry and experimental music and I don't know, contemporary art maybe, but certainly those poetry and music are the closest analogs to experimental film, I think.
Yeah.
So I don't mean weird I mean weird as in like if you're used to Marvel Comics films, then these films will seem weird.
Yeah.
But you might love them still. As we did. As at a certain point we fell in love with these films and kind of knew that it wasn't, we weren't going to, they weren't about to displace Hollywood or television or anything.
No.
Just, there's a thing that was for us richer and more, just more exciting, more exhilarating.
Yeah, that was what I was going to ask you, and I think all of you. How did you get to know experimental cinema, experimental film? Because I think, for instance, that Stephen got to know that, there are problems of archival, of the archive. Sometimes the films sometimes are not available. And for what I remember, what I can say was my mentor, Javier Aguirre, Spanish filmmaker, he always said, if they want to see my films, let them see my film, but they'll have to go for them. They have to watch them in cinemas, in museums. They'll have to look for them. I don't care if they see it or they don't. It's very different to Marvel films we have it everywhere. How did you get in touch? How did you even fall in love with experimental cinema?
Well, I'll start this one. I think we'll all have interesting answers.
Great.
For my part, I learned about experimental cinema very early because I grew up around experimental art, and so I would have seen the kind of material that was issuing from Mystic Fire Video in the late '80s, early '90s when I was very young, between like 6 and 10 years old. So I was seeing Maya Deren films, Shirley Clark films, things like that, the surrealist films that turn up, all that. That circulated well, like Un Chien Andalou and L'Âge d'Or, those kinds of things. And then when I came to university, I was very excited to be able to study experimental filmmaking, which I think makes me like kind of unique in most BFA classes in film and video, because most people just want to make Marvel movies, to use to use an example that didn't exist then in 2002. But I followed that. I followed it for a few years. I went away from it and started making documentaries and came back to it. And when I came back to it, it was as a preservationist, a restorationist. And by that time, I had gotten in touch with the idea that I lived in a city where this material was pretty accessible. We're very lucky in Toronto. We have many venues that operate. Some of them, before the pandemic, were operating virtually year-round. Showing experimental films. And so it's one of those things that one does find, if you find that it enters your life and you respond to it, it's very easy to get wrapped up in it. That's my experience and how I come to it. How I come to Canadian cinema, Canadian experimental cinema specifically, again, comes from those same years. I grew up around experimental film and music, much of which was Canadian experimental music. I didn't have to take an undergraduate course in art filmmaking to see a Mike Snow film. So I was very lucky in that sense.
Completely.
Anyone else want to take it on?
Do you remember?
How'd you get to learn about experimental films, guys?
Go ahead.
Just very quickly, I saw them first in university. I basically grew up on narrative films, and then saw them for the first time in class. But that was in Toronto in the 1980s, when you could only see films really in theater, experimental films in theaters, and any theater films in theaters. Now, as Jim says, it's very easy to see versions of experimental films through the internet.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of work that you can see online. And that's a great way to start to see them. And sometimes they're good versions and sometimes they're not so good versions.
Yeah.
I do want to say that the preservation element, the work that Stephen does is really important to preserve the history. And I think sometimes we think because I can Google something and it's there that it's always going to be there. But in fact, issues of archiving and preservation are really important for a lot of arts, and especially experimental film. So there's lots of stuff out there, but I urge people, if they have a chance to see them in a theater or see them in an actual film projection, it's a unique experience. Barbara, how did you come to experimental film?
Mike, if I can actually follow on that, sorry, Barbara, if I can follow on that for 1 second, just to, for the sake of Antonio's audience who might have Google more readily than a theater showing these kinds of things, of the filmmakers that we cover extensively in this book, many of them have put a lot of their work up online on Vimeo for free that you can just search for and watch. I'm thinking of Richard Kerr, Chris Gallagher, Christina Battle, me, many of us have. And so the work is actually quite accessible. We do have partners in distribution centers. We do hope that this will lead to things like film rentals for artists. But the work is accessible. The work can be found quite easily.
Sorry,
I'm sorry for
I was trying to play a film by Christina in Vimeo, but the sound got into. Barbara or Jim, whoever wants first.
Doesn't matter. Go ahead, Jim.
Funnily enough, and this is a good connection to our book here, I came to be excited about experimental film by reading about them, mainly in Andy Warhol's book, Copies of the Warhol 60s. I read that because I was into the Velvet Underground. So for me, like, rock music led me to everything I know, and still does sometimes. So it kind of led me to Warhol, reading about Warhol, and then in that reading about, his films and filmmaker Cinematheque and Jonas Mekas and Stan Brakhage. Right, he sort of writes Brakhage off, but I know the names, and it all sounded very exciting to me. So then I was involved in the kind of post-punk scene in Toronto. I'm in high school at the time, and there was connections there to the Funnel Experimental Film Theater, which was important in Toronto's history. And so I saw a few things there, and then then it was university, both official classrooms. I took Kay Armitage's avant-garde class, and I can't remember what it was. I know what it was. It was, Variations on a Cellophane Wrapper by David Rimmer. I just thought, this is for me. Like, this is film. This is what I want to see. And I've always been, kind of interested in that kind of work since then. I kind of really, and then it was just kind of, there were screenings around campus occasionally. I walked into another class of Bart Kestes, and he was showing Michael Snow's Presence. And although I hated it at the time, I was intrigued by the utter weirdness of it, you know?
Yeah.
This kind of, it was just, what the hell? And then, but it didn't keep me away from, there was a screening of in this film society before I got involved with it, of So Is This. It was a premiere, I guess, of the Toronto anyways, and by Michael Snow, and it was like utterly fantastic. Like, it was just, I just totally loved it. And so it was just kind of piece by piece, eventually it was like, from about 81, I guess, when I read Papiston to 83, there was a kind of conversion process that kind of made it clear to me that this was going to be even more interesting than Godard, or even, I can't say it. I was going to say Fassbinder, but I'm not sure about that. But it just, it all kind of led there. And then this is the thing, and being in university, I wasn't quite satisfied with what was going on in the funnel, and there wasn't quite enough going on. So me and a few other people kind of hijacked a kind of dormant film society at our college, in this college at the University of Toronto, and we used the resources available to us to create a experimental film series that ran for really almost a decade, and a lot of things came out of it. And we started with Kenneth Anger's Magic Lantern Cycle, which is important to me. But our first, Barbara doesn't remember this, but our first screening, first Canadian screening, I guess, of our artists with their work was Barbara and Mike Carmel. A double bill. It was a trilogy, and then the three films of Carmels, and it was great. It was that's what, and it just felt, well, we can do this. If no one else is going to do it, we can do it. The films are available. We could find the funds at the time, and so that we just kind of made it. It's just always people making things possible. That's Stephen talked about filmmakers uploading things to Vimeo, and then there's also projects like Ubu.com, which is a kind of semi-legal. I don't want to call it an archive because it could go away any day, but it's a resource anyways that's been unbelievable to me personally. So yeah.
Okay, so Barbara, now's your turn.
I came at it quite differently. I went to Ryerson, to film school at Ryerson in 1972, with the idea that I would make documentaries that would hopefully be on educational television. But once I started working with the medium, because we had a series of exercises that had to be fulfilled within, one roll of film, 3-minute roll of film. And so we had a whole bunch of exercises that led me to explore the medium, especially what one can do with editing. And if you removed the conventions of narrative, that you had to have characters and make a story, and you removed the thematic necessity of a documentary, then what were you going to do? How were you putting a film together? Why these images? How were you shooting the images? How were you editing the images? So through that process of making films, then I fell in love with cinema, with film, and never looked back. I never wanted to make a narrative, and I never wanted to make a documentary. So I was making these things that fall into experimental film. And Bruce Elder had set those, he taught at Ryerson for years. And he was very instrumental in introducing experimental film to Ryerson, but also more broadly to Toronto. And even though he wasn't my teacher at Ryerson, I sat in on some of his classes, and I did see a couple of experimental films. He showed Brakhage, he showed Bruce Bailey, but not a lot. I didn't in my mind say I am making experimental films. I just said I'm making a film that the way my mind works, the way I want to deal with these, the possibilities of image making in film. And and then I just continued and fit into this genre in terms of distribution, and the films got shown in that context. And then I saw lots more work, which I loved. And despite all the years of seeing experimental film, it amazes me that I can see people's work. And even though I make films, I can see other people's work and not have a clue how they made it. Just, be amazed by what this filmmaker did with film. And I have no clue how, but, I despite, however many years, what's 72 and now? 50 years of making and looking at film. It can still surprise me.
Yeah, that's an element of experimental cinema that the element of surprise in cinema, I think is important. As now I'm surprising you because there's no image. I don't know how I've done it, but there's no camera. This didn't happen in the analog times. This is because of digital. But anyway, there's my name. It's me. It sounds like me. Maybe now it's different. But
we don't see you, Antonio.
Yeah. It's this is there's that kind of films without camera, or that's now the interview without image. So now to finalize, the book has been presented some weeks, some months ago, and do you have a feeling how it has been received? Are there any initiatives where you were thinking courses about experimental filmmaking, maybe some retrospectives of experimental filmmakers? Are you changing the panorama of Canadian films now? Is Toronto International Film Festival going to be called Toronto Experimental Film Festival this year? What is going to happen because of this book, if you know it?
Well, it's been very well received so far, and I'm actually a little bit surprised that there hasn't been a little bit more, because in the experimental film world can be very brittle sometimes. I'm surprised that there hasn't been a more friction in that front. So, I think that's good, obviously, and I'm happy about that. We've done a number of successful launches of it. A big online one in Toronto, in cyberspace, and then we did a big launch at the TIFF Bell Lightbox. And then in Trent University in Peterborough and London, Ontario. And we have, we're working on finalizing events in Sackville, New Brunswick, and Montreal, and San Francisco and Berkeley.
Oh, right.
And, we're kind of really open. We're also talking to and organize about events at University of Toronto and Ryerson. What's it called now? The
Toronto Metropolitan.
Right. Yeah, Toronto Metropolitan University.
I intend to use Ryerson.
Yeah. So so our kind of invitation to the world is we're happy to help organize things. If you can pay artist rentals, that's the most important thing.
Yeah.
And then, if possible, we'll arrange for ourselves or filmmakers to be present. But the number one, just sort of price of admission is to pay fees to the artists.
That's
otherwise we're just kind of perpetuating something that we don't like. And so far so good. And I think I can't speak for everyone, but it's like this is now done and out there in the world, and there's no like woulda, shoulda, coulda, and none of those things matter, and no shoulds anyway.
Yeah.
The book is what it is, and it's time for other people to, if they are interested, to take it somewhere else, or propose alternative modes of discourse, I guess. So yeah, thanks.
Yeah, I would just add to that experimental film and media, the way which film interacts now with digital media, is incredibly healthy. For over a decade at TIFF, there's been an experimental film series called Wavelengths. Named after the Michael Snow film. And just this year, the Hot Docs Documentary Film Festival started an experimental series called Marker, named, I think, after Chris Marker. So there are ways in which experimental film continues to survive, but it's continuing to make its way into other realms in a really interesting way. So I certainly urge anyone listening to look for the way in which experimental film, experimental media, experimental documentary, the way this adjective, it comes along and it basically gives a jumpstart and revitalizes sometimes moribund forms of cinema.
Completely. Okay, so if no one else wants to, this is like a wedding. If no one else wants to say anything, I think we've done like a pretty good overview of this book, Moments of Perception. That's a good excuse for going back to the great moments, great filmmakers, surprises, as Barbara said, that experimental cinema can give us. And I think leaving this surprise in a screen, or even in a museum or university, wherever you discover experimental cinema, it's one of the moments that's worthwhile of living and of filmmaking. So thank you for translating us this sensation, this feeling of watching so many films in a book that I think anyone who reads it may feel completely fulfilled. So left to right, and with me from the darkness, Barbara Sternberg. Barbara, thank you very much.
And thank you, Antonio. On behalf of all of us, if I may, thank you so much for doing this and for taking your time and being interested in Canadian cinema and our book. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you.
Jim, thank you very much again. And Stephen, thank you for being with us. And we'll read you and we'll see you on the screens, of course. Thank you, and see you all the time. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Thank you.